Hi everyone, I'm John Oden, and I work on the development team at Boson Software. Welcome to our lab walkthrough for ICND1 Lab 1 entitled Using NetSim. This is the first in a series of video presentations that will help you get started with Boson NetSim, so if you're new to NetSim, then you're in the right place. What we're going to do over the course of the next few minutes is to cover some basic elements of Boson NetSim, and then we'll work through the lab. The first thing that I'd like to point out is the lab tree. Now, over here on the left side of the window, I'm going to expand the lab tree. You'll be able to see that this is an hierarchical view that shows all of the lab content that comes with the product. Boson NetSim comes in a few different versions. There's a version for the CCENT level certification concepts. There's another one for CCNA. And there's the version which I'm using here, which is the version for CCNP. And you'll look through the lab tree by scrolling up and down, and you can see that there are a large number of labs for the CCNP version, all 200 of them that cover all of the CCNP topics for route, switch, and T-shoot. You'll see those as I scroll down here a little further. And as I back up, you'll see that also the content for the CCNA and CCENT versions are also included in the CCNP version. And here's the lab that we're going to be working through right now. We're in the ICND1 module. And this is lab number 1, using NetSim, which is designed to familiarize you with the operation of the product, how to get into it, how to load the lab, and how to enter some basic commands. And this is going to get you ready to move on into the more advanced labs where you'll start to learn more advanced Cisco concepts. So to get a lab loaded into the simulator, all that you have to do is just point to the lab in the lab tree and give it a double click, and you'll see that it loads up, and there it is. I'll open the lab tree back up again, just to see that you can scroll up and down, and you could load another lab if you wanted to. If you're finished with this lab and wanted to go through another lab, you could just double click on another one and then it would load. Okay, so I'm going to put the lab tree away. And one of the other important elements of NetSim are the lab instructions, and you can see the tab up here at the top shows us that we're looking at the lab document, the lab documentation. And as I scroll through that, we're a little bit limited because of the recording dimensions that I'm using here for this video, but if you had a larger monitor, of course, you'd be able to expand this out and have a little bit more room to work in. So I'm going to scroll through this, and you can see just a little slice of the document up here at the top. And there's a number of detailed steps that walk you through exactly what you need to do to carry out the lab. One of the other components of NetSim that you'll want to know about is something that's called the net map. And if I click on that tab and scroll around a little bit so you can see it, what the net map is it is a live clickable topology diagram that represents the simulated network and the simulated devices in the network. Here you can see that we have 3 routers, each one connected to the other. And I can interact with any of these devices just by clicking on it in the net map viewer. And that brings us to the other element of the NetSim user interface that I want to show you, which is the device consoles. You can look down here at the bottom and you can see that I have a console window for router 1 by default. And this is the command prompt. This is the same thing that you would see if you were connected to a real router using terminal emulation software. I'm going to tap the enter key and you'll see the command prompt come up. And at this point I could start entering commands to work with router 1. If I wanted to work with router 2, I can just go into the net map, right click, and choose configure in simulator. And now I've got another tab down here, and this one is router 2. Now I can pop back over to router 1. And I could interact with as many devices that I have by just clicking into the console window and going to the appropriate tab for the device that I want to work with. Let's go back to the lab instructions just for a moment, and let me show you something else that I think you'll find useful. What we can do is we can open the lab documentation in an external window. So I'm going to go up under the main menu and choose Launch External Viewer. I clicked on the lab text command on the main menu. Then I'm going to come down and click Launch External Viewer. And when I do that, you'll see that the lab instructions sort of disappear from where they were. And where did they go? Well, they went over to my other monitor, which you can't see, but I'm going to bring it back. And you can see that the lab documentation now is in a separate window, that if you have a multiple monitor setup, you could drag the lab instructions document over to your other monitor, just like I'm doing now, and then that'll give you more room to work with the device consoles. So that's a brief tour of the main elements of the NetSim user interface, and we'll learn more about these as we go through the lab, and let's go ahead and begin that process right now. As we get ready to work through the lab, I would encourage you to do as I just did and open the lab instructions in an external viewer, and that way you'll be able to follow along, because as I work through these steps, just to make sure that you can see the most of the action, I'm going to leave the lab document out of the view of the recording, so you'll want to be referring to your own copy of the lab document as we go through it together. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started working through this lab. First, let's review our setup. I'm going to open the lab tree back up again here just for a moment and remind you that we are working in the ICND1 module of the standalone labs. So you should be standalone labs, ICND1, lab 1 using NetSim. That's where we're going to be working. So if you haven't loaded that lab already, just give it a double click. And once the lab loads, also, let's make sure that you've got the lab instructions open in a separate window. And like we saw just a moment ago, the way we do that is by going to the main menu, Lab Text, Launch External Viewer. What that'll do is to open the lab document into its own window that you can drag around to any other place on your desktop or to another monitor if you have one, just like I'm doing here. So here's the document, and I'll be bringing the document over, and then I'll be getting it out of the way of the console so that we can see what's going on as we go through this lab. Let's first take a quick look at the structure of this lab document. Now, this lab document, like every other lab document that is included with NetSim, is going to have a similar layout, and is going to begin with an objective listed up here at the top. And the objective for this lab is to be able to just get into the devices, make some simple configurations, and be able to understand how to save your work and come back and continue at a later point in time. You'll also see a diagram that shows the devices in your simulated network topology, and we have three routers, each one connected to the other. We've seen that already. And also there's going to be a summary of the Cisco IOS commands that will be used in this lab, and you can see that the commands are listed here with a brief description of what each command means. Now, if you're just getting started, you may not be familiar with these commands, and don't worry too much if you're not understanding exactly what's going on, because there are subsequent labs that will get into more detail about exactly what these commands are doing. But this very first lab is more of mechanical in nature, to just help you understand where to go and what to do as you're working through. And as we go down a little bit further, we'll get into the actual tasks that we'll carry out in the lab, and this is the first one, Task 1. As we work through this first task in our first lab, we're going to be configuring Router 1 in our simulated network topology. I'm going to click on the net map just so that you can get a reminder of what we're working with here. Here are our three devices in our simulated network topology. We're going to be working with this device right here, Router 1, and we already have the console window open for Router 1 down here below. So if I just click there and tap the Enter key a couple of times, we can see that Router 1's command line prompt is responding back each time we tap the Enter key. As you learn more about iOS, you'll begin to understand that there are a number of different modes that this command prompt can be in. And the mode that we're looking at right now is sometimes called user exec mode. And in this particular mode, you really can't do a lot. So the first thing that we're going to do is to elevate our privileges using the enable command. So I'm just going to type enable. And when I do that, you'll see that the command prompt changes. Instead of having the default host name of router with a greater than symbol, now we have the host name, which by default is router, with a #sign symbol. And that # symbol is our indication that we are now in a mode called the privileged exec mode, which is kind of like a super user mode where we have access to any command and we can do any kind of configuration on this device that we choose to do. In order to make changes to the configuration, we're going to have to get into yet another mode called the config mode. And we're going to do that by using the configure terminal command. I'm going to type it in right now. And this simply means that we're going to be entering some configuration commands into the iOS running configuration, and those commands are going to come from the terminal, which is where we're typing right now. So we're now at a place where we can begin to enter configuration commands, and the first one that we're going to enter is the hostname command. As I mentioned before, the default host name for an iOS device, specifically an iOS-based router, the host name is simply going to be router, and that's not too descriptive. So the first thing we're going to do is to use the hostname command to set the host name of router 1, even though it's labeled router 1 in the topology here. The host name of this device is not set yet. So we're going to use the hostname command to fix that. So you can see now that the prompt over here has changed, where before it was simply router. Now it is router 1 because I used the hostname command to make that so. So we've completed task 1. Task 1 was simply to get into enable mode and then to get into configuration mode and then use our first command, which is the hostname command, to set the hostname of this device to router 1. We just did that. So our next task, task 2, is going to be all about how to save your configuration in NetSim. So let's suppose that we've worked through a lab up to a certain point, and we might want to stop for the day and then come back tomorrow and continue our work. So to be able to do that, we need to understand how to save the configuration of our simulated network. Now let's move on to task 2. We've made a configuration change to router 1. So what would happen if we were to shut NetSim down at this point and start it back up and reload the lab? Well, we would find that our configuration change would not be saved. Well, why is that? Because just as with a real router, when we make a change to the device's running configuration, it's not persistent. So if we shut the device down without saving the configuration changes will be lost. And that brings us to task 2, which is going to show us how to save a configuration in NetSim. Here's the console of router 1 again, and we can see the change that we made, which is to use the hostname command to change the hostname of this device so that it actually is router 1. So in order to make that change persistent, so that if we were to close down NetSim and come back at a later time and be able to resume our work, what we're going to do is to go up to the main menu and choose Console and then Save Single Device Config. And just as the name of this command would imply, this is going to allow us to save the configuration of the single device that we have in the console window down below. Now we could save these configurations anywhere we want, but it would make sense to organize them in such a way that you could come back and find them again later. So in my documents, I've got a folder here called Boson NetSim Labs. I'm going to open that up, and within this folder, I'm going to create a subfolder just for this lab. Now you can organize these any way you want. This is just the way I'm going to do it here. Now I'm going to create a subfolder called ICND1, Lab 1, and I'm going to enter that folder, and I'm going to supply a file name for this device, which will simply be router 1. And then I'm going to click Save. And I can see that a dialog box comes up to let me know that the configuration of this device has been saved in a file called router1.rtr. Now to continue along with the steps in the second task of this lab, we're told to go back to the lab tree and reload the lab. So here we are back in the lab tree, the lab that we're working on. It's ICND1 Lab 1, so let's just give it a double click and that'll load this lab back into the simulator. Just start it back from the very first. Now that we've done that, let's go back to our netmap and just review that we're working with this device right there. And there's the console window for that device. Let's tap the enter key a couple of times to get the prompt coming back up again. And notice what's happened. The prompt has reverted back to its default of router. Why did that happen? Well, because we restarted the lab, and that rolled the lab back to its initial loading state, which had all of these devices with their host names set to the default. So what if we wanted to resume our work where we left off? Well, that takes us into task 3, where we learn how to load a previously saved configuration. And let's do that now. Notice there are a couple of options there. We're using the load and save single device config commands. Notice there's also a load multi-device config and a save multi-device config, and the difference between those, as the name implies, is that we're either, in the case of the load single device config option, we're just loading or saving the configuration of one single device, or if we're using the load or save multi-device config commands, this loads or saves configurations for every device in the simulated network topology. So to follow along the steps of this task, let's go back to the main menu. We're going to choose Console and then Load Single Device Config. We're going to go back into that folder that we created for this lab, and there's the configuration that we saved before. So let's just click on that and then choose Open. we'll see that that configuration has been reloaded back into router 1, and we tap the enter key to get the command prompt to refresh, and notice now we've been brought back to right where we left off. And that's how we can load a previously saved configuration back into a device in NetSim. Let's move on to task 4. So far we've seen that we can change the configuration of a device by typing commands directly into the device console. But there are other ways. We have the ability, using a feature in NetSim, to paste in configuration commands from an external source. And that's what we're going to take up in task 4. Task 4 is asking us to take these configuration commands right here and use the Paste Configs dialog box in NetSim to bring these configuration commands into the running configuration of router 1. Now, don't be concerned if you don't know quite what these commands do. We're getting a little bit ahead here. Just understand why we're doing what we're doing. We're seeing that there is a way to get commands into NetSim from an external source. We'll learn more about these specific commands a little bit later on. I've copied those commands over into Notepad. So watch what I'm going to do here. I'm going to do Edit and then copy them from Notepad onto my clipboard, then back to NetSim on the main menu, Console, Paste Real Router Configs. Why do we call it Paste Real Router Configs? Well, it's entirely possible to copy the configuration from a real router and paste it into NetSim using this feature. So with this dialog box open, I just did Control-V on my keyboard, which is the shortcut for paste, and you'll see that the commands that I had copied onto my clipboard have now appeared in the paste configuration dialog box. And if I click OK, then those commands are going to be delivered into the running configuration of whichever device I have as the active console window, which in this case is router 1. I tap the enter key and notice that my prompt has changed. Why did it change? Well, if we go back and examine the commands that we pasted in, we can see that the first one changed the host name from whatever it was to Tampa. And it also did a couple of other things. It took us into interface configuration mode for interface serial 000, and it set the IP address and subnet mask for this interface to the values that you see here. Subsequent labs will get into these commands in more detail if you don't understand quite what's going on here. Following along in the lab document in task 4, let's go back into enable mode and use the show IP interface brief command to look at all of the interfaces on router 1, and notice that serial 000 does in fact now have the IP address of 192.168.1.1, and it got that because of this command right here that we pasted in. Task 5 is going to show us that there's yet another way to modify the configuration of a device in NetSim. I've brought over an Explorer window so that we can examine the folder that we created to contain our configuration that we saved a little bit earlier. And if we double click, there it is. We did a save single device config, and it saved the configuration of the one device with which we were working at that time, which is router 1. And here in task 5, we're going to open up this. You can use your favorite text editor to open this file. It's just a plain text file. I'm going to do that right now. And there's the configuration file for router 1. We can see the host name is set right there, as well as the other configurations that have been applied. Now you may be thinking, well, didn't we just set the host name to Tampa, and did we not just put an IP address on serial 000? Well, yes, we did. But what we didn't do was save those commands. So if we go back to the configuration file for router 1, we're going to see that it's in the exact state that it was in whenever we did save single device config. If we wanted to capture the IP address and the host name that we just set in our previous step, we would have to go back and save single device configs again, which we did not do. So following along in task 5, we're told to edit the configuration file for router 1 directly and change the host name to Miami. And after we've done that, we'll need to save this file in our editor. I did a file save. I'm going to open it back up again just to make sure I've saved the work, and I have. We can see that. So we're now going to continue in task 5 and load this configuration back into the device. Main menu, console, load single device configs. We're going to go back into the folder where we saved our work before, and there's the file that we just modified just a moment ago, and let's load it into the device. I've tapped the enter key on the console of router 1, and we can see, sure enough, the host name has changed to Miami. Why? Well, because we just loaded in the configuration file for router 1 that contains the modification that we made externally using our text editor. So in this lab walkthrough, we've learned a little bit about NetSim. We've learned how to navigate through its user interface. We've seen how to go into a device and make a very simple configuration change. We've seen how to save our configuration so that we can come back and resume our work at a later time. And furthermore, we've seen that there are multiple ways that we can change the configuration of a device. We can do so by entering commands at the command prompt here and then saving them. We've also seen that we can paste in configs from a real device if we choose to do that. And then finally, we just saw that we can go out and modify those configuration files that are saved whenever we do a save multi-device or single device configs. Those are plain text files that we can open up using our favorite text editor. We can look at the configuration commands that are in there. We did, and we modified one of those externally using our text editor. Then we loaded it back into the device and saw the effect of what happened when we did that, and that was to change the host name using the text editor and then load the config back into the device and see the result of the change that we made. And there it is right there. Well, thanks for following along through this video. I hope it's been useful to you, particularly if you're a new user to NetSim. And I would encourage you to move on from this video walkthrough to the next lab, where we'll learn a little bit more about the commands that we used in the tasks in this lab. For more information about NetSim or any of our other products, which include instructor-led training and practice exams, check us out on the web at boson.com. And we also maintain a presence on Facebook and Twitter. You can check us out there as well, and I would encourage you to do so. In the meantime, we'll see you in the next video. Thank you.